The Tom Woods Show, episode 2127.
Prepare to set fire to the index card of allowable opinion. Your daily dose of liberty education starts here. The Tom Woods Show.
Hey folks, if you've decided it's best not to have your kids educated by people who have declared war on you, then consider the self-taught Ron Paul curriculum. Instructors like me will give your kids an unfair advantage and an education you and I could only have dreamed of. But make sure you join through my link, because only there do you get my $160 worth of free bonuses. My link is ronpaulhomeschool.com. Hey everybody, Tom Woods here. I am joined once again by our old friend, John J. Duncan Jr., better known as Jimmy Duncan, who was a U.S. Congressman for 30 years and was the last of the half dozen Republicans who voted against the war in Iraq in the House to retire. So he was in there with Ron Paul opposing that war and doing a lot of good. Now, some time ago, I guess probably a pretty long time ago at this point, I did an episode with my friend Roger McCaffrey where we talked about what happened to his little boy, his son John, who developed a kind of leukemia that's very rare in children. And there was a drug that showed very, very promising results, but it was not being offered to children. But without it, John had no chance whatsoever. And Roger wrote an article in the Washington Times and made a general appeal for help. And it turns out, what a small world, that it was Congressman Duncan who picked up the phone and called up Roger and said, "I can help you." I hadn't realized that part of the story. So he's a really, really great guy. I was very glad, as part of my School of Life program, to have him appear when we were talking about relocation. And he came and talked about Tennessee and did a terrific job. I just love being able to feature good-hearted, good, decent people like him. That program opens its doors again, by the way, in August, and it's the best thing I've ever done. So sign up to get notified when we reopen our doors, because we're going to reopen them and then slam them back shut again. So the website for that, tomschooloflife.com. Anyway, let's talk to Congressman Duncan. We're going to talk in particular about his very, very enjoyable memoir, From Bat Boy to Congressman, 30 Years in the U.S. House. Welcome back, Congressman Duncan.
Well, thank you, Tom. It's an honor for me to be here with you. And I will tell you that I very seldom miss one of your podcasts. If I'm not your biggest fan, I'm close to it.
Well, that is a very, very kind thing of you to say. And I have really enjoyed reading this unique memoir of yours. I've not seen one written in quite this style that I just told the folks about, From Bat Boy to Congressman, 30 Years in the U.S. House. What a life you've had. You know, you have to look back and say it's been quite a blessed life.
Well, it has. I've been very fortunate, and I have had one of the most unusual careers and have gotten to know the widest variety of people that you could imagine, everywhere from murderers to presidents of the United States. And I had a fascinating law practice, a fascinating judgeship, and then 30 years in the Congress. So my book has legal stories, sports stories, all kinds of things. I tried the attempted murder of James Earl Ray. My court was the only court he ever testified in. I once sang with Dolly Parton. I could go on, I suppose. But of course, most of my stories are about my 30 years in the House.
Well, let's start off a little bit early. Your father, was he mayor of Knoxville?
Yes, I was very, very proud of my father. My dad hitchhiked into Knoxville with $5 in his pocket. He came from a subsistence farm in very rural Scott County, Tennessee. In fact, when I was little, my grandparents, an outhouse was their bathroom, and my dad worked his way through the University of Tennessee and then went to law school after World War II. And 20 years after he arrived at the university, he became mayor of Knoxville. It's fascinating to think back. He led the peaceful integration of Knoxville, and in 3 elections for mayor, he got 90% of the black vote, which is unheard of for a conservative Republican. And then he ran for Congress in the Goldwater year. And of course, that was a terrible year for Republicans. After that election, there were 295 Democrats to 140 Republicans. In fact, they told all the Republicans who were being sworn in that they could bring anybody onto the floor they wanted to. And so my brother and I and my grandfather from Iowa, my mother was from Iowa, got to stand with my father when he was sworn into Congress in January of 1965. He served 23 and a half years and then passed away from cancer. And I ran in a special election to try to take his place.
And you were elected.
Yes, I was elected. I think it was the Washington Post had an article and said that the campaign against me that year was the most negative in the country. And it was a tough election. I had been a judge for 7.5 years before that, and I didn't really have to, but I didn't want to give them an issue, so I had resigned my judgeship to run. And I told my mother at one point, I said, Mom, if I had $1 million tax-free to get back in my judgeship and get out of this race, I would do it. It was miserable, but I won and made it. I had a very unusual thing happen to me on election night, though. The Associated Press, for about 45 minutes, reversed the returns. And I was standing on a stage at the Hyatt. Our biggest television station was going to have me on live in 30 seconds to declare victory. And then an Associated Press reporter pulled on my pants leg. He was down below the stage, and he says, Judge Duncan, he said, I don't know how to tell you this, but our returns show you way behind. And we very quickly found out what the problem was, but the Washington Post reported in its early editions that I had lost the election. Nashville television station, where my wife's grandmother lived, reported that I had lost, but all the official election commissions and all the other news media had the returns correct. And so I did win the election and was sworn in the day after the election because my father had passed away several months before.
Well, I don't know how many cases there are of such a thing happening, of the father is deceased and the son runs to fill his seat. Has that happened before?
Yes, it's happened a few times. In fact, the longest serving member of Congress in history, John Dingell from Michigan, succeeded his father. His father served from 1932 till 1955 when he died, and John Dingell took his place and stayed there forever. But I really didn't want to stay there forever. I have felt very fortunate to have served for 30 years, but I have 9 grandchildren here in Knoxville, and I wanted to spend a little bit of time with my grandchildren. And so I've been in Knoxville doing a little tiny bit of legal work. I've been writing weekly column. I've been doing a lot of things, and I think I maybe got out at a good time, actually.
Yeah, I think probably you did. What was it like, by the way, being the son of the mayor?
Well, actually, I worshiped my dad, but I hated being the mayor's son. I can tell you one little example. I had a very mean English teacher, Mr. Myers, and he had a box of pencils on the corner of his desk. If a student came in without a pencil, they could borrow a pencil. Well, one day, unfortunately, I came in without a pencil. I asked him, could I borrow a pencil? And he stood up and he said, in a very mean, loud voice, he said, fine, Duncan, fine, you can borrow a pencil. He said, pencils are just 2 for a nickel. And says, your dad's just mayor of Knoxville making $15,000 a year, and I'm just a lowly school teacher making $5,000 a year, but yes, you can borrow a pencil.
Oh, nasty.
So I didn't really like being the mayor's son, but they had a nice article in the Knoxville paper 11 or 12 years ago, and I described my father as the kindest, sweetest, toughest, hardest working man I ever knew. And I meant tough in a good way. And I got the nicest handwritten letter from Peyton Manning about that. And he said he had flown out of Knoxville the day that article was in the paper. And he could tell from that article that I had the same kind of relationship with my dad that he has with his dad. And I was a Peyton Manning fan before, but became even a stronger fan after receiving that nice letter from him.
And by the way, what you just said, there are like 150 stories like that in this book from all parts of your life. I want to say a little something about your years as a judge. Now, place us there. What years are we talking about, and where were you a judge?
Well, I was a lawyer and a judge for 16 years before coming to Congress. Slightly over half of that was in the private practice of law, and slightly less than half was as a judge. And I was a criminal court judge. I tried the felony criminal cases. And my first year as judge, for instance, I tried 78 jury trials in my court alone and 5 non-jury trials. Nowadays, the judges are shocked when I tell them that, because jury trials are slowly becoming a thing of the past almost. But it was a very busy time in court. I had many fascinating cases. And actually, to tell you the truth about it, I think most of the defendants really wanted in my courtroom because I would say probably 80 or 90% of the criminal court judges in the country were prosecutors first. I came at it from a background of doing criminal defense work. And so I had a little different view of things. And so I had a lot of people who wanted to be in my court instead of some of the other courts. But I enjoyed my time as a judge. My law practice had gone better than I ever dreamed that it would. And so I'm just, as you said at the start of this program, I feel greatly blessed. But then I went to Congress and I was frequently compared to Ron Paul, and he was actually one of my closest friends in the Congress. And I came to believe very strongly, as I mentioned in my book, that this country is governed by a big government, big business duopoly, and that socialism is good at only one thing, destroying the middle class. And you can see that all over this world. And in almost every country where it's been tried, it's been a failure. So that's why I agree with you on just about everything. And I certainly really appreciate the work that you do. In my weekly column, I wrote several columns about COVID, which Jane Fonda called it a gift to the left. So I was very, very saddened by the way that COVID was used and how much it harmed the people of this country and still is today.
Just one quick thing on your judge years, and then we'll move it a little bit ahead. But you mentioned James Earl Ray, and you've got him actually here in the book, page 33. So James Earl Ray is the man who was accused of assassinating Martin Luther King, although I know there are people who aren't convinced that he was the perpetrator. In fact, I think there are some members of the King family who aren't convinced of that, but I could be wrong about that. I don't remember the details. But you tell a somewhat embarrassing story about something that happened in your courtroom involving him.
Well, as you know from going through my book, many of the stories in there are humorous. There are actually 203 little vignettes or very short stories. And I had received very high ratings from the Bar Association. In fact, the highest you could receive just about. But I made the most embarrassing mistake that a judge probably could ever have made. They brought James Earl Ray into Knoxville. The case was transferred from another court into my court. It was transferred from another county. And the courtroom was packed. They brought James Earl Ray in with more security than they probably would have for anybody except maybe the president. They wanted to take a recess before he was put on the stand, so they took him back into my office. And I sat there with two Tennessee Bureau of Investigation agents, and James Earl Ray sat in the back part of my office and wasn't even in our conversation. And he started whimpering or crying softly to himself, and we weren't even talking to him. And I kind of thought, well, his years in prison had affected him very much mentally, I believe. But I came back into the courtroom. James Earl Ray got on the stand, and I said in a very stern judicial voice to the Attorney General, and I said, General Jolly, you want to begin your questions? And he said, well, fine, Your Honor, but don't you think you should bring the jury back in first? And I had forgotten to bring the jury back in with all the pressure that day. But there's not a very good way you can recover from that. But at any rate,
well, there it is.
I had a good experience as a judge. And in fact, I had to think really hard whether to give up that position. But I felt like if I'd spent my life as a judge, I would have lived to about 85% of my capacity. But I thought going to Congress would stretch me to the limit. And I believe that it did.
I suppose being the son of a congressman, you must have had some sense of how things worked and what to expect. So your learning curve would have been not as severe as that of, let's say, somebody with no experience at all. But what was your first year like in U.S. Congress? Just getting used to it, meeting everybody and stuff like that.
Well, I had a pretty good idea about the job because I had driven my dad around for many years and I had substituted for him many times. I was a little more, or maybe even quite a bit more conservative than my dad. And the first 6 years I was in office, we were in the minority, the Republicans were. And in fact, I have a little bit of an interesting story in there. I said that my 6 years, I voted along with almost all the Republicans against all the appropriations bills. But then after we took over and after the 94 election, I kept on voting against the appropriations bills. And Tom DeLay, who was the majority whip, he came down there and one time on the floor and he told me, he said, but these are Republican bills now. And I said, yes, Tom, but you're spending more than the Democrats were spending. I will give them some credit in that the Democrats were still criticizing us for not spending enough. But the thing that I think created the Tea Party was that once we took control, we didn't do enough to bring federal spending under control and try to return a little bit of that money to the people. But I am pleased that I can say I had a Tea Party voting record before there was a Tea Party. And actually, if everybody in Congress had voted the way that I did over my 30 years, we wouldn't even have a debt, much less a debt of $30 trillion. It's just mind-boggling to me. And I might say I'm very proud of Rand Paul on just about everything that he does, but I'm proud of him here just in the last few days for delaying this money to Ukraine. I went to Ukraine twice, and I looked it up when all this mess started. Ukraine's total GDP in 2020 was $155.9 billion, and now we're voting to send $54 billion over there, and they would be spending it so fast it would not be spent in an efficient way at all. And it really is doing more for the defense contractors. I've spoken out for years about the revolving door at the Pentagon, where the defense contractors hire all the retired admirals and generals. And all of these recent wars, for years I spoke out trying to get us to come home sooner from Afghanistan. And, it was a very sad thing for me. Tuesday night in Knoxville, I spoke at a program where they honored the mother of the last soldier killed in Afghanistan, the 13th young man, the 13th soldier in the last explosions. And his mother just cried. And if everybody had voted the way I had, that war wouldn't have even been going on for anywhere close to as long as it did. But it was all about money and power. More money for the defense contractors and more power for the generals who are at the height of their glory when they have a war going on.
Well, no kidding. I mean, of course, you were completely heroic on that. You were the last of the Republicans who opposed that war to retire from the U.S. Congress. So all you honorable people are out, but we remember that, and that's a vote that will be remembered for a long time. And along those lines, although your book is filled with mostly uplifting and amusing and interesting stories, let me ask you kind of the opposite. What's your worst memory from being in Congress?
Well, that's a good question. I've never been asked that.
I try to specialize in questions like that.
I don't know. I always felt very lucky to have my job. I will tell you that 99+% of the people that I was able to help in big and little ways were people who had not contributed to me, and I didn't expect them to contribute to me. In fact, I ran some of the cheapest campaigns in the entire country because I got a lot of work done by my family. But I guess one thing that was tough was sometimes I would be asked for help by people who I liked personally or maybe who I'd known most of my life. And for one reason or another, I was not able to help them. I think the most disappointing thing in a way was I just was sickened by the fact that the federal government just keeps taking over more and more land with each passing year, and that we're very quickly doing away with private property in this country because almost all the politicians want to create parks, and we've created so many parks at the federal, state, and local levels in this country that we can't even take care of in the ways that we should unless the entire population ended up going on permanent vacation. So there's a lot of things, and I'm very disappointed by how we've run up in debts. I always said the easiest thing in the world to do is to spend other people's money. And they told me one time that in one of the departments, they had big notebooks about all the members of Congress giving their bios, and at the bottom of each page in the notebook, they had questions that the members typically ask at hearings. And under mine, it had a question that said, how much does it cost? And I always thought that we didn't have enough members who cared about that. And I'm very proud of the 57 members of the House who voted against this last $40 billion to go over to Ukraine. I think that there are a lot of people in the Congress, both Democrats and Republicans, who care more about Ukraine now than they do about the United States of America.
Well, that's no question. That reminds me actually of something I just wrote in my newsletter a few days ago. I was quoting, I think he's a friend of yours, Bill Kaufman, the writer.
Yes, he's a very good friend of mine. In fact, he wrote a very nice article about me in the American Conservative magazine one time. It's reprinted in my book, but he wrote a nice review of my book, too, for the American.
Yes, I just read that review, as a matter of fact, and that's what put me in mind of this, because his theme has generally been, and this is not a theme exclusive to him, this is a theme we see in a lot of great thinkers in the West, that you can't have care for every single place or person in the world. That is impossible.
Right.
That you have to start with the household and then in a series of concentric circles going out from there. But you can't right every wrong, and you're going to create a hell on earth trying to right every wrong. And Bill, by contrast, is somebody who, far from being obsessed with this episode in that country or this one, he loves Batavia, New York. He loves where he is. And that, I think, is a similarity between you two, because when I had you on in my School of Life program, I did a unit on relocation, and we had Sheriff Hathaway from Arizona and a bunch of really great people from different states talking about states you might relocate to, where people might be able to stand you, and you came on to talk about Tennessee. And I'll never forget you saying that, look, I've been all over the world and I can't find a place I'd rather live than East Tennessee.
Well, that's correct. And I've always felt that way and still do. And Bill Kaufman really liked the fact that I criticized national searches, because I wrote in one of my newsletters, and he was fascinated by the fact that I always wrote all my own newsletters. And I said there were really good, well-qualified people in the 2.5 million people that we have in East Tennessee to get well-qualified people in all these positions. I found, because we had to do a lot of immigration work in our office, I found the University of Tennessee would turn cartwheels trying to get people over from China and India, but they didn't get too excited about the people that came in from Humboldt, Tennessee, or Saudi Daisy, or La Follette, or some of these small towns here. And I felt like their first obligation should have been to the young people of Tennessee.
Hey, everybody, just a quick message from Old Woods here. We know how bad the American healthcare system is. It makes everybody crazy. It costs a fortune. And it's not about just you and your doctor. Now it's you, your doctor, infinite layers of bureaucracy and insurance designed to make your healthcare expensive and, well, unsatisfactory. Well, that's where Crowd Health comes in. Crowd Health isn't health insurance. That's why it works. It totally reverses the vicious incentives that got the healthcare system into this mess in the first place. No deductibles, no networks, no complicated exclusions, no co-pays. You see any doctor you want, you pay the first $500 and submit any bills from there. Here's how it works. You pay one low monthly total to fund your account. That's less than $200 a month for most people. 100% of that contribution directly funds and reduces the healthcare costs of the Crowd Health community. And unlike insurance, Crowd Health succeeds by keeping its members happy, not by driving up the price. Crowd Health helps members shop for great care at a fair price, makes payments to doctors and members as quickly as possible, and negotiates on the community's behalf when unexpected bills arise. Stop paying health insurance companies your hard-earned dollars. Go to joincrowdhealth.com now and experience freedom from health insurance. Right now, you can get your first 6 months for just $99 per month. That's almost 50% off the normal price and a lot less than a high-deductible healthcare plan. Just go to joincrowdhealth.com and use promo code WOODS at sign-up. That's joincrowdhealth.com, promo code WOODS. Crowd Health is not health insurance. It's a totally different way of paying for healthcare. Terms and conditions may apply. Do you feel like 30 years in the U.S. House taught you anything you didn't know already about human nature or government or anything for that matter?
Well, of course, I learned a lot during those years. I traveled to many foreign countries. And I have great interest in national and international issues both. And it gave me the opportunity to speak out. And I got my undergraduate degree in journalism, so I've written a lot. I wrote 10 articles, for instance, for Chronicles magazine. I've written columns for many different newspapers around the country. So it gave me a chance to express my opinions, but I also knew, though, right off that the main thing was to try to take care of the people here in East Tennessee. And I found out that every place I went, whether it was a drugstore or a church or a school or whatever, that every place I went, people that wanted to express opinions or ask for help or both. But serving in Congress gave me some opportunities. I spoke well over 1,000 times to student groups in schools and in Washington. I thought that was important because I thought that a lot of times students are almost being brainwashed in some of these schools and especially in some of the universities. In fact, my weekly column this week, I talk about how Elizabeth Warren is filled with hate, but I also mention in there that conservative speakers are almost never invited to give commencement speeches, and that even if a young Republican or young conservative group brings a conservative speaker to campus, they have to get extra police protection because these left-wing students seem to be filled with hate. In fact, Charles Krauthammer, the late columnist, said that the main thing you need to know about American politics is that conservatives think liberals are stupid, but liberals think conservatives are evil. And so there's just so much hatred on the left side of the political spectrum today.
As somebody who was in Congress for 30 years, you would say that level of hatred has definitely intensified, and it wasn't like that when you entered?
Oh, yes, it's very much intensified. There's a big difference. I saw a big change from the time I started until now. I mean, I'll tell you, there was no question. I always had one of the most conservative, libertarian voting records that you could have possibly had in my entire 30 years in Congress. But I always felt like I could express my views without personally attacking people. The Democrats had control. They had the White House 16 of my 30 years in Congress, and that meant they had the top heads of the departments and agencies. So I had to try to get along with some of the Democrats, and I believe that I did. At least I tried to.
We'll round out this episode with a story or two, but before we get to that, do you have advice for young people, who look at the state of the country and they might feel despair? Do you have any words for them?
Well, I have great hope because I see so many young people standing up. In fact, we have had Charlie Kirk down to speak to 2 of the Republican dinners in my district just within the last couple of months. And he is going all over and speaking at campuses all around the country. And so I see a tremendous interest in conservative and libertarian philosophy now that I don't believe was there quite as strongly as when I first started. And so I have some hope. And I tell young people all the time, though, that the most important thing I can tell them is to try to pull themselves away from the very addictive screens and go out and help out a live human being. And their lives will mean more to them if they do. And there's so many organizations that they can get involved in, but so many people in the country, young and old, are isolating themselves, staring at the TV screens and the computer screens and their iPads and iPods all day long. And we need more human interaction one to another, I think.
Yeah, no kidding. No kidding. I was going to have you. Now, why not? Let's do the story about you were on the phone with Trump and you told him that your wife was upset at you about something.
Right.
So could he please talk to her, and how that turned out?
Well, I actually, as you can tell from what I've said earlier, I would have preferred Rand Paul being the nominee or somebody similar to him. But by the time it had narrowed down to, I think there were 3 left, John Kasich and Ted Cruz and Donald Trump. And I thought Donald Trump, I had gone to the Mayflower Hotel to hear his first foreign policy speech. And so I thought he was the most anti-war of the ones who were still in the race. And so I agreed to endorse him. So I did it at a Republican dinner on a Friday night in my district. And they told me he wanted to call me the next morning. Well, he called me and he was in a very good mood and he talked to me for about 20 minutes. And I told him 2 or 3 things that I agreed with him on. And then my wife was mad at me about something at that time. And I walked into the bedroom and I said, Mr. Trump, do you have a moment to say hello to my wife? And she went, no. But I handed her the phone anyway. And as I walked away, I heard her say, well, I thought he was pulling my leg. And then she talked to him about 5 minutes and she came out and she said, he was so nice. She said, he told me your husband sounds just like me. And she told him and said, I know, great for the country, but hell to live with. And Donald Trump thought that was one of the funniest stories I think ever.
That's great.
But also I had a story about George W. Bush on Air Force one time. I told him that when I was in law school, they used to say the A students made the professors and the B students made the judges and the C students made the money. And I said that about the C students making the money. He laughed and he said, "Are they become president?" I will tell
yes, indeed.
I will tell you, though, I like George W. Bush personally, but I was so disappointed because in his campaign, he advocated having a humble foreign policy and stopping trying to do nation building. And then the neocons got a hold of him when he got in the White House and did just exactly the opposite. And that was a great, great disappointment to me, unfortunately.
Well, no kidding. But it ended up being probably the most important moment of your political career, standing up against that war. I mean, what could be more important than that, honestly?
Well, I was against that war, plus I was against the wars in Iraq and in Afghanistan, both. But at any rate, just really, though, I want to say once again how much I appreciate the great work that you do. And I mean that most sincerely. I just wish we had more people speaking out like you do every single day. And I want to just say thank you for that.
Well, that is a very, very Congressman Duncan thing to say when he's being interviewed, to actually praise me, the interviewer. That's very kind of you. And so I will urge people, I've got it linked on the show notes page, tomwoods.com/2127, From Bat Boy to Congressman, 30 Years in the U.S. House, by our guest, Congressman Jimmy Duncan. Thanks so much, Congressman Duncan. Always a pleasure.
Thank you.
All right, everybody. Tomorrow, we're going to be talking about the social credit system in China. Is it really what we've been led to believe? And I've got somebody from over there who's going to be talking to us, and it'll be great and surprising. And you're going to say, I am so thrilled I listened to the Tom Woods Show. It's a great decision you've made, my friend, integrating this into your life. So thanks for listening, everybody. I'll see you tomorrow.
Become a smarter libertarian in just 30 minutes a day. Visit tomwoods.com to subscribe to the show for free, and we'll see you next time.
Like the sound of the Tom Woods Show? My audio production is provided by Podsworth Media. Check them out at podsworth.com.